Our second presenter is a faculty POP grant recipient from 24-25, Dr. Kara Styck.
And I'm in the psychology department affiliated with the school psychology program. So this work has come up from a few years of trying, unfortunately, unsuccessfully, to get some external funding. And what we study in my lab is assessment. And in particular, this area of assessment, we've looked at rater effects on teacher ratings of children's classroom behavior. We are specifically looking at social emotional competencies, and we've also looked at externalizing behaviors, academic engagement. When a teacher completes a behavior rating scale, they have a list of behaviors that they are looking for, and they have to search back in their memory, usually the past 2 weeks, sometimes the past month, and think about how often or sometimes to what magnitude or degree the child has engaged in those behaviors. So there's a lot of things that happen, right? They have to have a pretty good idea of what the behavior is that is listed on the item for the teacher behavior rating scale. They have to have a pretty good memory of what a particular child has done in their classroom over the past couple of weeks. And then they have to also have some idea of the anchors in their head. Like, what does it mean to do this a lot versus a little? What does often versus always look like, which is a terrible anchor point, but still shows up often. There's a lot of parts and pieces that go into this. So when we get these scores from teacher behavior rating scales, they are indirect measures of a child's classroom behavior that are filtered through the lens of the rater. And what we've done in my lab is we've looked at the scope and the nature of the problem. We have made some attempts to look at stability of rater effects and also to try to mitigate them. And a few things that we have found are that they are pervasive, they're prevalent, that we know that everybody comes with their own set of biases or lens that they are using when they fill out behavior rating scales. And it's different from person to person. So we find significant differences across teachers in every single sample, regardless of the behavior that we are asking them to rate for children, the grade level, etc. So we know that this happens and that this exists. We also have found that it is somewhat idiosyncratic. So when we ask different samples of teachers to rate children using the same exact rating scale, the same items don't show up as problematic. So one group of teachers might have a tough time rating certain items, like stays in their seat, where we found in one sample they thought of it as quite literally butt in seat, whereas other teachers might be a little looser with their definition of stays in seat. But then another sample of teachers might not have a problem with that item at all. So there's something going on that makes it a little idiosyncratic, which makes it a hard target to address, right? Because you can't just eliminate those items or revise them in order to perfect the rating scale. We know that this is now something that's going to show up in different places. We have also found that it tends to be stable within domains. So in terms of a person's severity or leniency, whether they tend to rate high or tend to rate low, is stable within a domain, but it's not necessarily across domains. So the same person who's really severe when they rate social skills might actually be really lenient when they rate academic engagement. So we found that that's not necessarily the case across domains. We've also found that it's fairly resistant to any types of rater training. So we've attempted to train away rater effects very unsuccessfully. That also, the success of rater training also tends to vary across domains, where there are some domains where, for whatever reason, people have a tendency to be much more variable in terms of their approach to rating that domain. So academic engagement, for example, people have a tough time with that. I don't know if that's because we expect kids to be academically engaged, and so if there's less variability within the presentation of academic engagement, then we kind of make things up So we're a lot more all over the place when compared to one another. But disruptive behavior was a little bit more amenable to rater training. So those are some big findings that we found. And we've attempted to take this to scale with video calibration to try to see if we were able to figure out what a teacher's level of severity leniency was with video ratings. They're rating children on videos. Then we can then take that information and adjust scores when they rate real kids so that we essentially wash out the rater effect. So we tried to do that. NIH didn't like that, or the panel did not like that very much. We tried. We got good scores, but didn't get much there. And then my most recent attempt was to really dive deeper into differential rater functioning, just because we know from some research that there tends to be systematic biases. And we've looked at gender, for example, where teachers rate boys and girls' social skills differently on certain items as a result of expectations that are different that teachers have for boys and girls. That was not well received either. So this is my half-baked idea for how to take my most recent unsuccessful grant and move it to a more successful project. The purpose of all of this work, the broad purpose, and really the purpose of this project, is to try to make assessments better. And we can do this from a couple different avenues. And what this work really hyper-focuses on is how do we identify items that maybe trigger biases in teachers, and we can rewrite them. We know that there are certain items that tend to be problematic, so how can we identify those and adjust for those? Also to see how this impacts the outcomes for children long term. And that is the theme of the feedback that we've received from our unsuccessful grant proposals is, okay, yes, we know this is a problem. We see you admiring the problem, but what are you going to do about the problem? And so that's been the general theme. And so this is my next attempt to try to lean into that a little bit more. The first goal of the project, we need to figure out what are the items that are evoking bias in teacher behavior ratings. And there's this wonderful data set that's a little bit older, the SECCYD. It is a longitudinal data set that followed children from birth all the way through college age, and it has a whole host of measures. And some of the measures that are used are a bit dated, but one of them in particular is one of the most commonly used measures in research for social skills and externalizing behavior. And so even though the most recent iteration of that scale is different, a lot of the items are the same. And so what this data set allows us to do is to look at a problem longitudinally and the impact of rater effects on the expectations that a teacher has for a child and how that may lead to cascading effects over time in the child's classroom behavior, and in a way that's not so far from what measures are currently used today. So we were going to look at that first with social behavior, and then secondly with internalizing and externalizing behavior. And that third piece is how can we make sense of this and do something about it, is to estimate the impact long term of teacher bias in these ratings on the decisions that are made with kids and how that impacts their classroom behavior later on. The significance for this: we know that social emotional competence is really important. It is like the bedrock of 21st century skills. These are critically important. And we also know that an adult's social emotional competence is the byproduct of a number of cascading factors from childhood. So, and these are interrelated, these are very complex processes: sensory maturity, attention, memory, the ability to make predictions and inferences about another person's behavior that you are talking to. Motor development, emotion label learning. Can we identify more than like 3 or 4 emotions and make sense of those? And children with disabilities in particular have deficits in different domains of functioning that might interrupt these cascading processes and set them on a different trajectory than other children. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a good example of this, where a lot of research shows that it's not so much the social skills, but the externalizing behavior that impacts them most in terms of their ability to make and sustain friendships. Is the fact that they don't wait their turn before they talk to another person. They tend to interrupt, or the kind of intrusive style in which they join a group. So it's not that they don't understand taking turns and the social behaviors, but those externalizing behaviors are problematic. We know that these skills are largely assessed and evaluated, and even the outcomes of intervention programs are through these teacher behavior rating scales. And there's a lot of literature that suggests that teacher rating scales can have some bias, and we've certainly demonstrated that a lot in my lab. So we know that the scores that we get are, again, a function of what's happening with the child and the lens of the person who is completing the rating. And there is another body of research that shows that teachers can convey the expectations that they have for kids in ways that impact their classroom behavior. Moving away from social emotional competence, there was a large research study that found that kindergarten teachers, they placed within classroom groups for reading programs. They made decisions based on where they believed that kids were reading at, but even if you controlled for their beginning level reading in kindergarten, boys of average reading skills compared to girls with average reading skills were more likely to be placed in lower level reading groups. So boys who are literally doing what's expected, they're reading at the average level, were viewed by their teachers as less capable readers than girls in those classrooms, and they were placed in lower tracks as a result. So we know that teachers' expectations can impact the way that kids behave in the classroom, and that can have implications for their end of year learning and then the beginning year learning of the next year, and so on and so forth, and can have these cascading effects that interact with other things as well. So what we're going to do is continue to use ROSH analyses. We've looked at many facet ROSH models with comparing teachers to look at rater effects, and then ROSH models without the many facet component, in order to really estimate and showcase these cascading effects of teacher bias on student behavior ratings. This is essentially my idea, is to kind of break it down and look at social behavior very specifically in year one, and then externalizing and internalizing in year two, and then in year three to look at those cascading effects using that longitudinal data set that has that rich data. So some stuff that we've done recently in the lab. We have a paper under review where we looked at gender bias for teacher ratings of social behavior for 240 students in grades 2 through 5 who were rated by 14 teachers. Not only did we find rater effects, but we found that teachers rated boys more severely on sociability versus girls. So there was different expectations for what that looks like. And then attentiveness for girls being rated more severely than boys. Although we found this, when we looked at this from the level of who is doing this, so what many-facet ROSH enables us to do is it doesn't just enable us to say that bias exists in the scores, but you can also identify on what items and by what teachers. And then you can also, if your data set is big enough, you can look at on what items and by what teachers. So you can look specifically at what teachers are rating boys and girls differently on what items, which is extremely helpful, especially if you are thinking about intervention and ways to address this. So what we found when we looked at it by what teachers is that by and large, even though teachers as a group tended to rate boys and girls differently on these two items, the most bias was happening by a few teachers. So it's some teachers tend to rate boys and girls significantly differently, and all teachers on some items. And we found a similar pattern in terms of some items and some teachers when we were looking at externalizing behavior with this particular sample. So impulsivity and turn taking, teachers tended to rate boys more severely on these things versus girls. And they tended to rate girls more severely on having tantrums and controlling or coercive behavior versus boys. So there is precedent that this is happening and that these scores are being used within multi-tiered systems of supports to identify what kids need extra help and what kids don't necessarily need extra help. And so it's being fed into programmatic decisions. And the goal of our work and the goal of this project is to try to make better systems so that we can have fair assessments that equitably distribute resources to the students who need them the most. And that's my half-baked idea. What ages were we looking at with these studies, and then have we found similar findings with other ages? With the differential rater functioning, these were elementary aged kids, so they were in grades 2 through 5. We have data from a middle school sample of students who were in a Nigerian international school, and so we're in the process of looking at teacher behavior differential rater functioning with that data right now. And based on the self-report with just differential item functioning, there were certain items. So one that I don't think anyone will be surprised about is eye contact. It shows up continuously, even though we know that this is a highly culturally specific behavior. And it showed up as differentially difficult for certain groups of students versus others. And so I suspect we'll see a lot of parallels with the student self-ratings and the teacher ratings of their behavior with that grade level. For that particular data set, we have self-ratings and teacher ratings, and so we could, not directly, but because they're separate, and the items aren't all parallel wording, but we could look to see if boys and girls rate themselves differently, then teachers rate boys and girls differently. So we could definitely compare across those. Have you looked into characteristics of teachers that might lead some to rate boys and girls differently? And no, we haven't looked at that. One thing sort of adjacent, one of my doctoral students looked at teacher self-ratings of culturally responsive classroom management self-efficacy. And what we found was that in general, teachers tended to rate themselves very high on that. Kind of similar to what we just heard with the other talk, that people felt that they did very well in that domain. But we did find that there were some differential item functioning when we looked at years of experience, and if you were a general education versus special education teacher, and a male versus a female, that there were certain items that tended to kind of lean into certain things. Like, I can't remember the exact items, but there was a series of items basically on discipline through like delivering consequences, and male teachers tended to rate themselves as doing that much more often than female teachers. And so there is some precedent for that with some of our other work. When you have multiple teachers rating a student and there are patterns like this with differential rating functioning, kind of what can you do about that, or what are the recommendations? What we have found with other data where we weren't looking at bias in particular is that the average score tends to do pretty well. We had some data where we had direct behavior ratings, which is sort of like the perfect marriage between teacher behavior rating scales and systematic direct observation, where you're in there and you're not basing it on memory, but the snippet of information that you're observing in the classroom at the time, but still filling out a rating scale, so you still have all of the biases of what is always versus sometimes and all of that kind of good stuff at play. And what we found was, so we did this with video clips, and we did 1 second, God bless my students, 1 second on off, like basically recordings to try to get like continuous recording estimate of how much or the exact duration that the behavior actually occurred versus not occurred. And we use that as the gold standard to look at accuracy with and without training, and then over time with and without training. And what we found, although training wasn't really that much better, didn't significantly improve the accuracy versus no training, and we didn't really see effects over time. And unfortunately, statistical adjustment didn't do a whole lot either, but I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the averages just kind of washes it out. Versus if you pick apart individual students, you see that there's a dramatic difference between an adjusted score and an unadjusted score. And I realize I didn't explain what that is, so I'll come back to that. But to answer your question directly, what we found was the observed average of multiple raters was pretty darn accurate. And so if you have multiple people, multiple ratings, the average of those ratings in our study tended to correspond significantly and positively with those 1 second estimates of the behavior. So that tended to do really well. But then with social behavior, I know there's literature beyond our lab that suggests that teachers are pretty good at pinpointing how kids feel about other kids, and parents are less so. So you might see pretty big differences between how a parent sees their child and how a teacher views their child, because the teacher is using cues that the parent doesn't have access to. A parent can't see how their child is being treated by other children when they're trying to navigate social situations, but the teacher does. And so the teacher uses that information as part of their cue as to how they're going to fill out the rating scale. And so you see pretty big differences between parent and teacher ratings.